Okay. Welcome back, everyone. Hope everyone had a quick, but it'll be a good break. I'm Zach Spicer, and I'm going to be the moderator for this upcoming session. So we're moving from public opinion to a more policy-focused session. So we have two panels on housing policy in Canada. We're really excited about this. Pleased to be moderating the first one. On this first panel, we have Allison Smith, Joanne Heritz, and Justin Rain, all presenting very interesting studies on housing policy. Very similar to the last panel, we'll go about 10 to 12 minutes each. I will kind of interject in as subtle a way as possible to let the presenters know when they're running out of time. We will leave some time for all of your fantastic questions and comments. If questions pop up, please feel free to drop them in the chat, and I will get to them as soon as the presentation's wrapped up. So to start us off today is Allison Smith, who is an assistant professor at the University of Toronto, presenting a paper called Housing Policy in Canada, Ideas, Institutions, and Place. With that, I will hand it over to Allison.
Thank you, Zach. So I'll share my screen and then start my slideshow. Okay, I need to swap displays, I think. All right, is everybody able to see my slides, not my notes?
I am. Yes.
Okay, great, thank you. All right, so thank you so much, everyone. I'm so happy to be here. Thank you, Zach, for moderating this panel, and to everybody who's put it together. I've been really looking forward to this conference for a long time, and I'm so interested already to hear from other panelists and for those who are coming later today, from people who are attending, including those who have the quantitative skills that I don't have, but really value for this type of research. Also community leaders and lived experts in the room. This is a really unique opportunity to have a great conversation amongst a lot of different people. In the presentation today, I'm actually having a hard time even focusing my brain on that title that Zach talked about, because there've already been so many things that I want to talk about and address and get into. In the presentation today, it's not going to be so much of like an empirical demonstration of new data, but I want to make a couple of points and sort of point to a few avenues of research that I think will be interesting. And I also think that there are some of the questions that were raised earlier in terms of what is driving NIMBYism that my presentation will talk to a little bit today. So for the past year or so, I've started to look at the history of housing policy. I do also do work on homelessness and how the welfare state produces social protection for people who are unhoused or are at risk of being unhoused. And I think I've often found it really interesting and kind of curious that my discipline of political science does not really consider a lot of housing, and doesn't really consider housing to be a social policy or a core part of the welfare state. I do think that housing is a core area of social policy. I can get into the reasons, I won't get into that now, but I have started to try to work on bringing the history of housing policy into the literature on the Canadian welfare state and social policy. We were sort of encouraged to think about starting with a poll. I wasn't able to actually make a poll, but so I thought I would begin with just a question. I'll have to pull up the chat because I'll ask you to answer the question in the chat here. So in some of my reading about the history of housing policy, I came across this quote here. "It's not appropriate to continue the argument so dear to politicians and social workers that we are in the midst of a housing crisis. The truth is, Canada has been in the midst of a continuous housing crisis." So my questions to you, if you can write in the chat, are, when was this said? Sorry, those dates should be indented. If this was a poll, I would give you the options of 2008, 1980, 1993, 2017. And as a bonus question for anyone, who said this about housing policy? 2 1980s so far. 1993, Paul Martin. 1993. That's a good answer, Paul Martin. Anyone else? 1980. Ah, you guys, I thought this was going to be more surprising. 1980. You ruined my surprise. So yes, 1980. The point is, And what I think is really quite interesting, I guess you can tell we've got policy wonks in the audience, people who know what they're talking about. Maybe in a different room, this would have been more of a surprise, but here we're talking to housing policy people. So you know that this is not a new thing, that there is a housing crisis. There is, of course, currently a crisis of housing, but there has almost always been a crisis of housing for people with low incomes. Those people like the Kitchener Lived Experience Working Group was talking about unsatisfied renters who are unable to buy homes. There has long been an inability to find adequate, affordable housing. So to some extent right now, I think, or there has been a lack of that type of housing. What we're seeing right now, I think, is history repeating itself to some extent. Michael Prince wrote about housing policy in the 1990s, and he wrote then that his look back on the history of housing policy showed that the main moments of intervention of governments in the housing system have been when that crisis began to start to affect the middle class. And I think right now we're seeing that again. We're seeing, as of 2017, the National Housing Strategy adopted in a moment when the housing crisis has really expanded. So it's not just that governments are increasing their involvement, they're also doing that classic liberal welfare state thing of trying to create better market conditions for the provision of housing. And that's especially in Ontario. So much of the coverage of housing right now is focusing on zoning and density, opening up the market. And I think that this reveals that a lot of the discussions and a lot of the definition of the problem isn't necessarily about deeply, well, it certainly isn't about deeply affordable housing for people, for example, who are on social assistance, people with low incomes. But there are discussions about what role the private sector can play, kind of reveal that this is looking at housing for the middle class. Again, this was from a few months ago, just a couple days ago, the Globe and Mail was blaming City Hall for Canada's housing shortage. So I think here that definition, a housing shortage, City Hall certainly has a role to play there. But in the presentation today, I do want to make one point, ask one simple question, and there's actually a few more than 3 theories, propose a couple of theories for why we might understand this, and to the extent possible, get the feedback of the many experts in the room on where work on this can and should go. So the point being, there has been a nearly constant crisis of housing for people with low incomes in Canada. Government involvement in housing policy has varied wildly over the course of the past 100 years, perhaps more so than any other area of social policy. I'm not totally confident to say that, but I do think that government involvement in housing has swung significantly in a way that we haven't seen in social assistance, pensions, healthcare, other areas of policy. Really, 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 really fast history here. Greg Sutter has written what is the authoritative text on social and affordable housing and the history of that in Canada, called Still Renovating. In that book, it was published in 2016. So the book, he identified six eras of housing policy history. He has since written that the National Housing Strategy from 1917 constitutes a seventh era. So the early era of public housing, there was very minimal government involvement, but those next 2 eras from 1965 to 1985 were what he kind of calls the heyday of public housing. So while there has always been a crisis of low income housing, it was not nearly as severe during that period as it would go on to become in the 80s, 90s, and up until now. The closest that the country came to meeting the housing needs of low income households was in the 1960s and 1970s, when both senior levels of government were investing heavily. And that's a really important, there's an important sort of federalism dynamics there, because in some cases there was competition between the federal government and the provinces. Both were investing in kind of trying to shove each other out of the space, and doing so by protecting housing policy, by being actively involved. And in this era, that meant that there were up to 25,000 units of social housing built per year. This was in addition to about 100,000 units of rental housing built per year. I'm getting off of something. A bit of a cold, sorry. I'll try to talk not so loudly. This wasn't enough housing, but it was going a long way to meeting housing needs. Sutter estimates that about 50% of low-income housing needs were being met through social housing at this time. That system ground to a halt in the 1990s, and governments collectively decimated their interventions. BC and Quebec continued to invest to some extent, but other provinces totally cut back. So my question is very simply why. I'm going to drink some more water, sorry. Sorry, I have such precious time here. I don't mean to waste it. So, oh, this slide didn't come quite the way that I wanted it to. So I think in terms of understanding why government involvement in the field of housing policy has varied so significantly, the literature does give some ideas why. So federalism and other institutions, as I've kind of alluded to, is oftentimes an explanation for why social policy is what it is and evolves the way that it does in Canada. Mike, I think, pointed out that in Ontario in particular, this is a very complicating factor. Ontario is the only province in the country that has downloaded responsibility for housing to the municipal level. So that means that in Ontario, it is crucial that there is tri-level agreement amongst all three levels in order for housing to work, because otherwise there's a mismatch. The level of government that has the resources is not the level of government that has the authority for housing. And this is a huge problem in Ontario. Resources also certainly go a long way in understanding why governments have invested and cut. 1993, there were huge cuts across the board to housing, and that was in a time of debt and deficit. It was an attempt to try to bring the budget under control. However, since the 1980s, not including the National Housing Strategy, the most significant investment in housing policy, in affordable housing, was in 2008 under Stephen Harper. Housing was defined as economic stimulus and as infrastructure and as an investment. Because of that, even in a period of recession, there were investments. So there's limits to the understanding of how federalism and resources shape housing, the involvement in housing. I know, Zach, I've got a couple minutes left. Thank you. I want to, I've been really interested in ideas in how policy problems are understood and by citizens and by researchers, by citizens and by policymakers. I'll skip over place, but I think that when we get to this idea of public and local opposition, something that the literature on social policy and housing in particular has pointed to is not so much an opposition to the building itself, but prejudicial attitudes that neighbors and citizens have towards the people and who the idea of the people who will be living in that housing. If I can quote from Greg Sutter really quick, this is even in the 1960s. Opposition to public housing was inextricably tangled with opposition to high-rise apartment development. Suburban opposition also responded to the Ontario Housing Corporation's large-scale purchases of new apartment buildings. Middle-class neighbors were concerned about residential status and amenity, changing social mix, income, and race, and high-density development as a surrogate for these. I think that this is really an important dynamic here, and there's room for public opinion to really test this and to really measure this. He writes, suburban councillors responded to such resident voices, but were also concerned about demands for social services. So there's, I'll wrap it up here. I think that in terms of understanding, again, the involvement of governments in housing policy and meeting the housing needs of people, not just in the middle class, but low income people, there are institutional forces and barriers, there are resources, but I think there are also ideas, and there's room here for collaborative work and for the inclusion of lived experts and quantitative analysis in better understanding this particular dimension of the evolution of housing. Thank you so much. Sorry for my interrupted presentation there. I'm very interested in questions and feedback. Thank you.
No problem. Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing this interesting project with us, Allison. I'm sure there will be lots of questions. For now, let's turn to Joanne Heritz from Brock, who is presenting a project entitled Women's Lived Experience of Housing in Niagara. So Joanne, the floor is yours.
Oh, geez. Okay. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Zach. I appreciate that. And thank you for the invitation to join you today. I'm just really enjoying this conference and just being able to share share with you my project. So I'll just start off. So women's lived experience of housing in Niagara. This project came about out of a policy brief on affordable housing that I wrote with two colleagues for the Niagara Community Observatory. It's a public policy think tank at Brock University. And the NCO approached me to write a policy brief with the YWCA Niagara region. I'm also a member of the board of the YWCA. And we received a grant for our project, Improving Safe and Affordable Housing for Women During and After the COVID-19 Pandemic. This project aligned with the YWCA strat plan for 2019 to 2024 to build community partnerships and advocate for affordable housing. The goal of the YWCA NCO partnership was to raise awareness of the desperate need for increased safe and affordable housing for women and gender diverse people in Niagara, resulting from poverty and worsened by the economic disruption of COVID-19. The current housing crisis of decreasing affordable housing stock, despite increasing need, underlies the urgency in listening to the lived experiences of women and gender diverse people. Women-led households are disproportionately renters in Canada compared with the general population. Furthermore, women that are Indigenous, Black, racialized, newcomers, seniors, members of the 2S LGBTQ plus communities, low income, or live with a disability are the most impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic and affordable housing shortages, and historically have been the least represented in policy processes. Women are substantively underrepresented in both elected office and senior management and local government, and their underrepresentation is even lower in Niagara. Another contributor to the urgent need for affordable housing for women and gender diverse people is the fact that the population of Niagara, and this just basically echoes what we've heard this morning already, is expected to grow significantly for the next 20 years from approximately 450,000 to just over 60,000, an increase of 30%. Forecasts for core housing stock for affordable housing indicate that housing need will continue at present levels across Niagara. In a nutshell, current forecasts indicate that apartments will be the highest demand, requiring an additional over 19,000 new units in the next 20 years to meet target growth, or 870 units annually across Niagara. These projections also indicate that the largest unmet demand for housing in Niagara will come from people in minimum wage sales and service occupations that are a significant sector in Niagara, and especially with Niagara's tourism industry. This demand will also come from equity deserving groups who are more likely to be renters than homeowners. This community-based research project focused on lived experiences, also referred to as lived expertise, referring to women who have knowledge and experience about everyday life, especially regarding issues of housing, and face additional intersectional barriers. Lived experience advisory groups acknowledge the inequities in society and believe that including individuals experiencing homelessness is a shift to a balanced approach to ending homelessness in Canada. Our research aimed to shift the role of the person experiencing homelessness from a social services recipient to a housing policy advisor. And to achieve this, our goal with YWCA's board of, our way to achieve this goal was for the YWCA's Board of Directors Advocacy Committee to establish a housing advisory council. And it was created specifically for this research project. The Housing Advisory Council consisted of the YWCA Executive Director, women with intersectional identities who have experienced homelessness, members of organizations who represent people with lived expertise of homelessness, and members of the YWCA Board of Directors and Brock's Niagara Community Observatory researchers. The Housing Advisory Council guided this community research project. Its first task was to determine the questions for the 3 focus groups. 2 focus groups, including current clients and women in transitional housing, were held at the new YWCA Transitional Housing Oakdale Commons, as seen in this slide. A 3rd focus group was held virtually with Niagara Region's Lived Experience Advisory Network. Altogether, 20 participants joined the focus groups. The data from the focus groups were analyzed by the research team and 2 SSHRC-funded RAs, and the participants' stories fell into 6 interrelated themes of barriers, affordability, support systems, trauma, discrimination, and safety. The women we talked to were actually not renting apartments, they were actually renting rooms. And so one of the things we found is that they were even, number of these women were on OW or ODSP, and they're, they just didn't have enough money to even think about renting an apartment. And some of them were really were in the process of finding somebody to share a room with in a house. One of the issues was that their landlord could be renting them a room, but they could be in an apartment or another dwelling where they didn't even know who the other occupants were in that, they didn't know the other occupants that they were sharing kitchens or bathrooms with. So you can imagine their safety was very much impacted by their situation. And also, in addition to the themes that they reported on, they also made recommendations. Now, just some of these recommendations, there's you'll have to read the report to go through all of them, but I believe that some of them are just worth noting here. Just increasing internet access at public libraries to the community. Some of these people have issues. Some of the focus group participants had issues even with acquiring or keeping a phone. They locate affordable housing is not always in areas with access to supermarkets or banks or public libraries or community gardens. They actually asked to provide transportation assistance, transit tickets, and volunteer drivers because it's just difficult for them to get around. Providing accessible phone support systems to navigate health, welfare, and licensing. To provide on-site support services and shelters, community and transitional housing, counseling and support services. So, and if I could just add another aspect of this that you'll be able to read in the report itself, but the trauma is very much a very significant aspect of housing and homelessness that people don't often, for women who are facing intimate partner violence, leaving a situation doesn't end trauma. That a lot of people that are seeking shelter or seeking affordable housing really need supports. They need mental health supports, and that's where the transitional, actually a demand or a need for supportive housing or transitional supports should be very much put into the equation of increasing affordable housing. And the purpose of the policy brief was to raise awareness of the desperate need and also action to increase safe and affordable housing. And also another aspect of the policy brief is that the increased cost of housing is actually going to place more people in core housing need. People who are making minimum wage, even making livable wages. In the current housing climate, they're actually going to be placed in a position where they will be adding to those people who are in need of social housing. And so I just thank you, and I look forward to your continuing the conversation. And I'm actually going to put the I'll put the link for that policy brief in the chat. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Joanne. Oh,
Now I'm just trying to get out of sharing my screen. Am I still sharing?
no.
No, you're
Oh,
not.
okay,
No.
thank you.
Excellent. So thank you very much for that fantastic presentation. Now we're going to hear from Justin Rain from Toronto Metropolitan University, who is presenting a paper entitled Bringing Accountability Back into the Realm of Canadian Politics, a multi-level governance analysis of Canadian housing policy. Justin, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Zach. Can you guys hear me okay?
We can.
Awesome. So let me just pull up my screen here. Share. So let me see if I can. I saw everyone, there was like a swap screen so I can see my nose part of it. I'll figure it out. Okay. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to the organizers of the conference for having me. I appreciate you taking me under consideration. So my name is Justin Rain, and this paper is actually my dissertation. I'm in my 5th year at what was Ryerson and is now Toronto Metropolitan University, and this is my doctoral research. So, like Zachary said, my title is Bringing Accountability Back into the Realm of Canadian Politics, a multi-level governance analysis of Canadian housing policy. So, okay, so my research is focused around the policies around housing in Canada. So whereas some researchers will focus on the homelessness and the quantitative data around that, I'm trying to focus a little bit more around what policies are in place and how does that impact those suffering from inadequate housing. So my research question that I pose is, Canada's current political framework sufficiently accountable to those suffering from inadequate housing? And I know that's pretty broad for the most part, but for my dissertation, I think that covers a large realm of those policies that when I first started, we didn't see this National Housing Strategy or even the National Housing Strategies Act that you guys, I'm sure, all are aware of. So I'm doing my research, as all of you are, in this time where we're seeing this implementation of this new policy, and we're reacting and seeing how that's actually going to be implemented by our government. So this research that I'm conducting is largely going to be reactionary into what's happening in our current system. So I have 2 theoretical frameworks that I'm implementing within my study, and the first one is multi-level governance. This is a public administrative theory, and what's great about this framework is that it allows me to look at multiple levels, because as Allison pointed out, the housing can't be looked at with one government. You can't look at Canada alone or Ontario alone or Toronto alone. You need to look at it through a cooperative lens. And this theory allows me to look at it and analyze housing, but also considering all levels of government and how they need to work together to establish a strong housing framework. And my second theory is the human rights-based approach. And this allows me to come at housing from a human rights perspective, right? Understanding that this is a human right. This is something that when I first started was only at the international level, but now it's actually a legal doctrine in Canada, and how that is framed to help with the implementation and what that looks like on the ground level, right? So coming from it from both the multi-level governance and human rights-based approach perspective will allow me to frame my research so that it focuses on all the levels of government and how it can implement it to support the human right that is the right to housing. So I have two main methods that I've implemented for this research. The first is my case study. And the case study I'll get into in a second. And I've done interviews. I'm still working through. I'm in my 5th year, and I'm really hoping to get through finishing the research and the interview phase pretty soon. So I'm going to share with you my findings thus far, and I'm looking forward to hearing what you guys have to say about that after. So, to start off, I chose to do a case study of Ontario. Ontario is the largest sample population that I chose to use as a province. Now, considering the multi-level framework that I've implemented, while my focus is Ontario as a sample of a larger, because for me to write about each individual province, each individual city across Canada and Canada would just be not possible for this research. So I'm focusing on Ontario's policy, but also through the multi-level governance lens of how is it related to the Ontario, maybe to municipalities like Toronto. And I'm using this framework to help conduct my analysis of the case study that is Ontario. So I've noticed, and as was mentioned previously in this panel so far, is that federalism plays a huge role. In the Constitution Act, we see that in Section 91, the federal government has jurisdiction over Indigenous reserves, territories. We see the provincial has property and civil rights. But most people will then say, it's property and civil rights. That's provincial jurisdiction. Housing's under provincial jurisdiction. But that's not the clear-cut case. We see that that property rights doesn't mean housing rights. And I'm sure you guys all can appreciate that. So this leads us to what is the government doing? And over the history of housing and the housing policy, we see a constant downloading of responsibilities where the federal government says, oh, it's not my responsibility, provinces, you're up. Provinces say, oh, it's not my responsibility, municipalities. But then the municipalities say, okay, but I don't have the resources. And then we see this constant battle between different jurisdictions in Canada that have resulted in poor housing and lack of support for those who are in need of housing. We're seeing that current provincial action, so in terms of Ontario, is really on the supply side. They're very capitalist focused, and they are also downloading responsibility because the main people responsible for implementing housing policy in Ontario are service managers. Service managers are essentially municipal workers, and they're the ones who are in charge of implementing housing policy in Ontario. So we're seeing that Ontario is then shifting their responsibilities to municipal workers. So we're seeing still today this battle between, well, I have the resources, but I'm giving the responsibilities to someone else. I have the money, but I don't want to do it. And this battle between jurisdictions. And then we have the federal policy, which is this now, as of 2019, this human right to housing. And 2019, and then we had this whole COVID pandemic, which has slowed the implementation process. So we're just starting to see, and I've actually spoken with several members of the National Housing Council, which was implemented in this National Housing Strategies Act. And they've said in my interviews that they're working, they've only met once or twice so far, but they seem to be on the same page, and they're said that that it looks like they have a path moving forward. So this implementation process, we don't know what it looks like right now, but I'm hopeful that based on the conversations I've had so far, that moving forward, there is opportunities for stronger and more robust housing policy if it is implemented. Again, that's a big if. So, I've also conducted interviews. So my two main criteria for participating in this study was there needs to be a Canadian resident or citizen. My focus is on Canada. I really want to make sure that the people who are I'm speaking with have firsthand experience living in Canada. And also they need to be a public sector employee, either MP, administrative civil servant, political official, whatever they may be related to housing. I'm speaking with them. Advocacy groups are so knowledgeable on the housing issue. They're the ones fighting for the human rights. So based on that human rights-based approach, the advocacy groups are really in line with my theoretical framework. And I'm also talking to academics like yourselves in Canadian housing policy, who are so knowledgeable of the policies that are in place, the political system. And so those are the three main groups of people who are combining for my study. So my goal going into this was, if I could speak to 20 people, I'd be super happy. And I think I can get I'm not claiming to be able to represent all of Canada. Every academic or every MP says this, but if a select few people can share their ideas with me to be able to say that, there are experts in the field who believe this, I think that we can get a really strong research base to be able to put forth some findings in the Canadian housing policy. So thus far, I've spoken to 14. I've reached out to over 100 people across Canada and I've spoken with former ministers of housing in Ontario. I've spoken to advocates from Vancouver, Edmonton, Toronto. I've spoken to academics from, again, all over the country. And it's really interesting to see the shifts in what someone would say in Vancouver versus Toronto versus Edmonton versus Manitoba. And I'm really fortunate to have spoken to so many interesting and knowledgeable people. So from these findings thus far, obviously I'm not done, but I will share with you some of the findings that themes that I've found within my interviews. And the first one is that Canada could be doing more, is that there's a huge consensus that they have the money, they have the resources, but they're just not willing to implement it in ways that can work in conjunction with the provinces. They have to be more willing to communicate, right? It's this communication between not just like I said earlier, the provincial, municipal, and the federal levels, but they're just not being able to see eye to eye. And a lot of the people who I've spoken with have said that housing needs to be taken leadership at the federal level. The federal level needs to take the lead role in getting this done. Next, I explore a lot of this.
1 minute, Justin.
Perfect, I'm almost done.
Thank you.
I explore this interplay between private interests and public interests. And I've found that actually, well, going into this, I wasn't sure what they would say, but a lot of people say you can't avoid private. You just can't. You need to be able to implement them in a way that works with the public system. And we see that this National Housing Strategies Act, it's new. We don't know exactly how it's going to be implemented. So it's a lot of ifs. A lot of people are just responding with ifs in this situation. If we do this, if we do that. So again, that's something moving forward. Here are some great organizations I thought I'd just share with you guys. I've spoken with people from all of these advocacy groups, CEOs, directors, and they're just really, really great. So I thought I'd share that with you. Here's my contact information. If you want to talk to me, if you're interested in my study, I'm happy to talk with you. If you know someone who may be interested in joining my study, I'd be happy to talk with you about that too. But that's my contact information. And thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Justin. This is a fantastic project. So thank you for joining us today and sharing with us a bit about your doctoral work. I wanted to open the floor up for questions. We have about 6 minutes. And so if you have a question for any of the panelists, please either raise your hand or write your question in the chat group. Just going through the chat, I did notice Simon had a comment for Allison at the very beginning. I just want to, Allison, do you want to maybe respond to Simon's comments?
I think I was so interested by the results of your study, and I was really interested in like the solutions part that you presented, those sort of two categories of solutions, whether it was the sort of more zoning stuff versus government involvement. And I would be so interested, because that to me speaks to respondents are answering that question with a definition of the housing crisis in mind, that some of them have defined it as middle class And those people are maybe saying, that would be my suspicion, that they're saying this is a question of zoning and red tape and municipal involvement. Whereas people who are saying this is a lack of government involvement, a lack of government investment, are maybe defining it more broadly. So I think it'd be really interesting to look at those two sets of questions and who is answering in those two different sets. And I wonder if there's something about like that definition of the housing crisis that might sort of help to explain a little bit of what's going on there. That was just one of my thoughts that I saw when you were talking about causes, because the thing that really stuck out to me was the solutions.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And I see that Laura has a question.
Yeah, I do. Thank you so much for 3 really thoughtful and interesting presentations. I think a thread that pulls them together is the need for multi-level coordination on the part of different governments to address the housing crisis, with a particular focus on people who are experiencing poor housing need or homelessness. And I know this is a very specific question, so I apologize. I know that the federal government has put forward a number of co-investment funds designed to encourage the private sector to, and not-for-profit sector as well, to invest in affordable housing. And Blueprint Consulting released a report on these programs this March, showing that they've been abject failures. They've produced very little affordable housing, no affordable housing at deeply affordable levels. So looking at actually like 30% of income, or looking at levels that social assistance recipients could afford. And so my question is, these federal co-investment strategies have not worked. What should the federal government be doing? Should we go back to the federal government fully funding social housing? Do we need more stringent conditions around the way the federal government provides funding to developers to build affordable housing? I'm just curious from your perspective as experts on what you would see as being a good direction.
Good. Perhaps I'll just start with that, if that's okay. One of the issues is the federal government can provide funding, but one of the issues is also the idea of having land and having places to build. So that is an issue, and that's something that is really downloaded right now at the municipal level. And I agree too, because the federal government also had a rapid housing initiative that really wanted people to speed up, getting their projects. But one of the things is that although the federal government is good at giving money, they're not really, they're not really supportive of those other aspects that are required. So that funding still depends on the provincial governments, and also depends on municipalities. And I see Allison shaking her head, so I'll let her continue the conversation.
Thanks. Yeah, that's such an important point, and this really goes to the importance of a multi-level approach. And like Justin was talking about, this is not just levels of government, but also sectors. One of the things that I think is interesting to look at history in like the 60s and 70s is what was happening then? Why was the housing system more inclusive then than it is now? And when you look at the way that funding was offered by the federal government at that time, like Greg Sutter writes, like the taps were open, money was flowing freely. It was unsustainable, to be fair. It may have been unsustainable, although the current situation is also unsustainable. But so 75% of capital funding was provided for social housing or nonprofit housing was provided by the federal government. 100% of operating subsidies were provided by the federal government. I'm not totally sure about the COVID ones, but in the like affordable housing, the affordable housing framework agreement and investment in affordable housing, the funding formula changed, where the federal government said, we'll give $25,000 per unit of housing. Provinces or municipalities have to match that with another $25,000. So there's a maximum $50,000 subsidy of housing. So housing is more expensive to build in some places than in other places. Deeply affordable housing is very expensive. And the definition of affordable was left up to the provinces. So Ontario just said affordable means less than market rate. That was even for upper middle class, it was sometimes unaffordable. So the funding that was available, if the government said we will contribute 75% of capital, no matter what it costs, then housing can be built where there is need. Whereas if it's $50,000 max and you got a private sector partner, they're going to build where that is still profitable for themselves. So that's just kind of one example. I understand that like more money is not the like, it's kind of an easy answer, but I do think that like looking at what was successful, one final thing that I'll mention, Justin talked about the importance of the private sector. Again, in Greg Sutter's book, he says that the affordable housing that was built was directly piggybacking on a boom in rental, 100,000 units of rental, 25,000 units of social or nonprofit mixed together. And that was the most successful period of housing policy. And it is very, very far from anything that has been proposed now.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Allison. We are at time. I actually think we're 1 minute over. We have another panel coming up. I just wanted to briefly thank all of our panelists today. I also wanted to note that Justin has made a really great comment in the chat, just to sort of feed off of Laura's question. So please check that out. Sorry that we couldn't get you in here at the end, Justin, but thank you again for your fantastic presentation.